Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, and you're listening to BriefingsDirect. Bringing broader awareness of security risks and building a security-minded culture within any public or private organization has been a top priority for years. Yet halfway through 2021, IT security remains as much a threat as ever, with multiple major breaches and attacks costing tens of millions of dollars occurring nearly weekly. Why are the threat vectors not declining? Why, with all the tools and investment, are businesses still regularly being held up for ransom or having their data breached? To what degree are behavior, culture, attitude, and organizational dissonance to blame? Stay with us now as we probe into these more human elements of IT security with a leading Chief Information Security Officer. To learn more about adjusting the culture of security as a means to making organizations more resilient, please join me now in welcoming our guest. We're here with Adrian Ludwig, Chief Information Security Officer at Atlassian. Welcome, Adrian.
Hey, Dan. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. So, Adrian, why are we constantly bombarded with headlines showing us how IT security is failing? Yet for many people, they just continue on their merry way, business as usual. Are people's perceptions off base? Are we living in a world where they're assuming that breaches amount to acceptable losses? Are people not concerned because the attacks are someone else's problem? What's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of those are probably true, depending upon who you ask and what their state of mind is on a given day. It's definitely the case that we're seeing a lot more than we've seen in the past. And there's some interesting twists to that language, right? What we're seeing is not necessarily imply that there's more exploitation going on or that there are more problems, but it's definitely the case that we're getting a lot more visibility. So I think it's a little bit of both. There probably are more attacks that are going on, and it's also that we've built an environment where we have better visibility.
Well, if we're of a mind that security is just the CISO's worry, people like you, should the rest of us just forget about it, or is security something we should all be thinking about?
It's interesting how quickly things that people don't want to think about, they appoint somebody and they give them a fancy title and they say that person is now responsible for making it happen. But the reality is, within any organization, doing the right thing, whether that be security or keeping track of where the money is going or making sure that things are going the way that you're expecting them to be going, it's a responsibility that's shared across the entire organization. And so I think that's something that we are now becoming more accustomed to in the security space, is realizing it's not just about the security folks doing a good job. It's about enabling the entire organization to understand what's important in order to be more secure and making that as easy as possible. So there's an element of culture change and also an element of improving the organization.
What's different now that makes these softer approaches, that being behavior, culture, management, attitude, why are they important now? Is there something about the way the threat has changed or the way in which security technology has changed that makes us now need to look at how people think about security, not just what they do with their machines?
I think we're beginning to realize that technology is not going to solve all of the problems. When I first went into the security business, the company that I worked for, actually as a government agency that I worked for at the time, still had posters on the wall from World War II, right? Loose lips sink ships. And the idea of security culture is not new, but the awareness across organizations that any person could be subject to phishing, or any person could have their credentials taken, or those mistakes could be originating at any different place in the organization. I think that broad-based awareness is relatively new. It probably helps that we've all been trapped in our houses for the last year and paying a lot more attention to media and have heard about attacks that have been going on at governments and hacking, and all of those things I think have raised awareness as well.
I find it frankly confounding that people in their personal lives have to authenticate. They don't want their credit cards or bank accounts pillaged. They seem to have maybe a double standard between what they think about is protecting themselves or protecting the company they've worked for or the government that serves them.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I think we used to think enterprise security could be more difficult from a user experience standpoint because people would put up with it because it was work. I think you might be touching on something that's interesting there, is whether the opposite is true, whether people are more self-motivated. And so in the consumer space, they're willing to put up with something that's more challenging than they would in an enterprise. And there might be some truth to that, Dana.
I think there is, because, the passwords I use for my bank account are long and complex, and the passwords I use when I'm in the business environment, maybe not so much. So it's interesting how that works, which gets us back to our point, which is how you think and your attitude needs to be improved for security to become a pervasive goal and a culture in the organization. So how do we get people to think differently?
Well, I think there's a few different things to consider. One is that I think the security people need to think differently. It's not necessarily about changing the behavior of every employee in the company. Some of it is about figuring out how to implement technical solutions that provide security without changing behavior. Or, there's a phrase, the paved path or the paved road, making the secure way the easy way to do something. When people started using U2F, some people use the brand name YubiKey, right? A little token that you put directly in your laptop, then you tap on it in order to do the authentication, as opposed to, and you can use that as a second factor authentication. And it turns out that that's actually a lot easier than having to input your password all over the place, and it's more secure. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for, is how do we enable enhanced security while also having a better user experience? And what's true in authentication could be true in any number of other places as well. Atlassian is primarily focused on developers. So we think a lot about how it is that we can make the developer experience more secure, how we can build confidence and trustworthiness in the software that we're building, but also in the types of tools that our customers are using our tools to build.
Well, you brought up another point that is of interest to me, because there's a mindset that when you hand something off in an organization, it could be from development into production. It could be from design into manufacturing. It could be from a business management prerogative into action and business process that people seem to forget and move on. But with security, that handoff really is probably a risk factor. So beginning with developers, how are you changing that handoff? And should developers not be thinking about security in the same way that the production people are? And how does that cut across other handoffs or silos within companies?
I like to think about security is really about having the whole system work the way that everybody expects it to work. And if there's a breakdown anywhere in that system and it doesn't work the way you're expecting it to, then all of a sudden you say, oh, it's insecure. Whereas nobody really has figured out what those hidden expectations are. So a developer is expecting that the code that they write isn't going to have vulnerabilities in it. Even if they make a mistake, even if there's a bug, that shouldn't introduce a security problem. And there are improvements that have been made in programming languages that help with that, right? There are certain languages that are very highly prone to security being the type of failure that's a common failure. I grew up using C and C++. Security wasn't something that was even thought of in the design of those languages. Java, a lot more security was thought of in the design of that language. So it's almost intrinsically safer. Does that mean there are no security issues that can happen if you're using Java? No. There probably is a C++ purist that will go after me there. But it does mean that it's less likely and the types of failures are less prone. So that's something that a developer would think about. Then there are similar types of sort of expectations that exist at other places in the development pipeline as well.
And I suppose another shift has been for those applications developed in C or C++, they often resided in the data center, behind the firewalls, behind the perimeters. And you didn't worry about that code being vulnerable. But now with microservices, cloud native applications, multiple APIs being brought together interdependently, we're no longer aware of where the code's running. So don't you have to think differently as a developer because of the way in which development has shifted and the way in which applications are being in production has shifted?
Yeah, it definitely has made a big difference. We used to describe applications as being monoliths. And so there were very few parts of the application that were exposed. At this point, most applications are microservices. And what that means is across an application, there might be 1,000 different parts of the application that are publicly exposed. And all of those have to have some level of security check being done on them in order to make sure that they're going to be handling input that might be coming from the other side of the world is being handled correctly. So, the design and the architecture has definitely exposed a lot more of the surface. There's been a little bit of a race, right? The tools are getting better, but the architectures are getting more complicated. And so far, I don't know, it's neck and neck on whether or not things are actually getting more secure or whether they're getting less secure as the architectures get bigger and more exposed. And so we have to think about that. How do you design processes to deal with that? How do you design technology? And then to your point earlier, what's the culture that needs to be in place? I think part of it is having a culture of every single developer. They're not going to be thinking about security day in and day out, but they need to be conscious of the fact that the decisions that they're making do have security implications.
I think another attitude adjustment that's necessary is we have to assume that the security has less than 100% effective capabilities.
Yeah.
So taking the assumption that breaches are going to happen means you try to stifle them as quickly as possible. It's a little different mindset, but the more people that are involved with looking for anomalies or are willing to have their data examined or their patterns of behavior examined for anomalies makes sense. So what's the cultural shift that goes with assuming that you're going to be breached, but making sure that that damage is limited?
I think a big part of the cultural shift is being comfortable taking feedback from anybody that you have a problem and that there's something that you need to fix. So that's sort of the first step, I think, for a lot of companies is letting anybody identify a security problem. And that could be anybody inside the company. It could be anybody outside the company. Bug bounties, I think, were a bit of a revolution in terms of enabling better visibility into potential security problems. Once you have that sort of culture, then you have to start thinking about, okay, how do I actually monitor what's going on in each of the different areas, right? And visibility, exposing that, having an understanding of what it is that's going in and out of specific applications so that you can detect when there's something that's not what you're expecting. And what to expect turns out to be really difficult if what you're looking at is something that's very, very big and very, very complicated. And so decomposing an application down into smaller pieces, being able to trace the behaviors within those pieces, being able to understand what APIs each of those different, what we call microservices exposing, turns out to be really, really important as well. And so if you combine decomposing applications into smaller pieces, monitoring what's going on in them, and then creating a culture where anybody can find a potential security flaw, surface it, and then you have to react to it, those are good building blocks for having an environment where you can have a lot more security than you would have had otherwise.
I suppose another shift that we've had in the past several years is the advent of big data. And not only the fact that we can manage big data quickly, but that we could do it at a reasonable cost has brought about machine learning and movement towards artificial intelligence. So is there now an opportunity for us to take another quiver tool, another arrow in our quiver of tools, and that being using big data machine learning to try to buttress our security and maybe provide a culture of awareness as a result?
I think so. I mean, there's a bunch of companies that are trying to do that in this space, trying to look at the patterns that exist within applications, understand what those patterns look like. In some instances, alert when there is something that's not operating the way that it's expected. In other instances, maybe guide you towards re-architecting in order to make your application more efficient or more secure. So there's a few different approaches that are being explored. Ultimately, I think at this point, most applications are so complicated and have been developed in such a chaotic manner. It's impossible for anybody to really understand what's going on inside of them. So that's the right time to let the robots give it a shot and see if we can't figure it out by turning the machines on themselves.
Yes, fight fire with fire. Let's get back to the culture thing, though, because if you ask all the people in the company to think better and differently about security, they'll nod their heads and they'll try. Yep. But there's also has to be a leadership shift, perhaps. So who is in charge of security messaging? Who is the best voice for the message in a company to tell people with certainty, with feeling that they have to think differently and better about security? Who's in charge of security?
Not the security people. And I think that'll be a surprise for a lot of people to hear me say that. The reality is, if you're in security, you're not normal. And the normal people don't want to hear from the not normal person who's paranoid that they need to be more paranoid, right? And I think that's a realization that it took me several years to realize, that if the security person keeps saying the sky is falling, people aren't going to listen to that. If they say security is important, it's like, well, yeah, of course, security is important to you. You're the security guy. If the head of the business or the CEO consistently says, we need to make this a priority, security is something that's really important, and these are the people that are going to help us understand what that actually means and how to execute on it, then that ends up being a really healthy relationship. The companies that I've seen turn themselves around to become really good at security are ones, Microsoft, Google, others, where the CEO made it personal and said, we're going to fix this, and it's my number one priority, and we're going to invest in it. And I'm going to hire a great team of security professionals to help us make that happen. And I'm going to work with them and enable them to be successful. The ones where the CEO said, the board said I had to get a good security person, so I've hired this person and do what he says. That's the path to a disgruntled bunch of folks across the entire organization saying security is just lip service. It's not that important. We're just doing it because we have to, which is not where you want to end up.
You can't talk the talk. You have to talk the talk and walk the walk, and you have to do it all the time over and over again with a loud voice, right?
Yeah, and eventually it gets quieter, right? Eventually you don't need to have this the top level saying this is the most important thing. It becomes part of the culture, right? People realize that's just the way, it's not so much that's just the way we do things, but that is a number one value for us. It's a number one thing for our customers. And so it'll end up happening.
So security mindfulness as the fabric within the fabric of the organization. But to get people to get there requires change, and changing behaviors is always been hard. So are there carrots? Are there sticks? Both when the top echelon of the organization, public or private, commits to security as part of their fabric of the organization. How do you then execute on that? Are there some steps that you've learned or seen that help people get incentivized or whacked upside the head when necessary?
We definitely haven't gone for whacked upside the head. I'm not sure that works for anybody at this point, but maybe I'm just a progressive when it comes to how to properly train employees. Maybe that is a proven mechanism for getting a job done. What we have seen is just talking about it on a regular basis, just asking, are the things that we're doing from a security standpoint working? Are they getting in your way? Honestly, showing that there's thoughtfulness and concern going into the development of those security improvements goes a really long way towards making people more comfortable with following through on them. A great example would be, you roll out two-factor authentication and then you ask, is it getting in the way? Is there anything that we can do to make this better? This is not the be-all to end-all. We want to improve this over time. And that type of introspection by the security organization is kind of surprising, I think, to some people. The idea that the security team doesn't want it to be disruptive, that they don't want to get in the way, can go a long way towards it feeling as though these new protections are less disruptive and less problematic than they might otherwise feel.
And because your organization, Atlassian, is focused on developers, you're working with developers to help developers. And developers can be not the most, I guess...
ornery.
Ornery works. So if you can make developers work towards a fabric of security mindedness and culture, you can probably do it to anybody. So what have you learned? What are some tried and trues, maybe even some anecdotes or use cases of how you've been able to inject a better security culture within a developer core?
A lot of it starts at, again, as we mentioned, it starts at the top, right? We have core values that invoke vulgarity as a way to both emphasize how important they are, but also how simple they are, right? One of Atlassian's values is don't fuck the customer. And a result of that is it's very easy to remember. And it's very easy to invoke, hey, if we don't do this correctly, that's going to hurt the customer. We can't do that. That's a top level value. We also have open company, no bullshit. So if somebody says, I see a problem over here, then we need to follow up on it, right? There's not a temptation to cover it up, to hide it, to pretend it's not an issue. It's about, driving change and making sure that we're implementing solutions that'll actually fix those things. But there's countless examples of a feature that was built and we really want to ship it, and it turns out it's got a problem and can't do it because to do that would actually be a problem for the customer. So we back off and go from there.
Words are powerful, brands are powerful, messaging is powerful. What you just said made me think that maybe the word security isn't the right word. If we use the words customer experience, maybe that's better. Have you found that? Is security the wrong words nowadays? Are they outdated? Should we not be thinking about security? Should we be thinking about an experience at a larger level that connotes success and progress or something?
It's super interesting, actually. So Apple doesn't use the word security very much at all. As a consumer brand, what they've focused on is privacy, right? The idea that they've built highly secure products is motivated by the user's right to privacy and the user's desire to have their information be private, but they don't talk about security. And I always thought that was really an interesting decision on their part. When I was at Google, we did some branding analysis and we also came up with that. Like if you talk about security, it's a negative from a consumer standpoint. And so most of the references that you'll see coming out of Google at this point are security and privacy. And they always attach those two things together. So it's not a coincidence. I think you're definitely right that the branding is problematic. Microsoft uses trustworthy and trustworthy computing. So I guess it's the rest of us are a little bit slow to pick up on that. But ultimately, it's a combination of security and a bunch of other things that we're trying to enable to make sure that the products do what we're expecting them to do.
I like resilience. I think that kind of cuts across because it's not just the security, it's how well the product is architected, how well it performs. Is it hardened in a sense so that it performs in trying circumstances when there's issues of scale or outside threats and so forth? So how do you like resilience? And how does that business continuity line of reasoning and thinking come into play when we're trying to improve the culture?
Yeah, resiliency has gotten a pretty good name, I think, in the pop psychology space as well, as one of the things that you try to convince your children or make your children be more resilient. Those are the ones that end up being the most successful, right? It certainly is an element of what you're trying to build, right? A system that it's not going to be perfect, and there's an understanding it's not going to be perfect. It's going to have some setbacks, and you need to have it recover when there are those setbacks. You need to design with an expectation that there's going to be those problems, right? I still remember the first time I heard about a squirrel shorting out a data center and taking down a whole data center. It can happen, right? It does happen. Or, you get a solar event and that takes down a computer. So there's lots of different things that you need to be able to recover from that are accidental. And there certainly are ones that are a little bit more intentional, like when somebody deploys ransomware and tries to take your pipeline offline.
When we think about those silos in order to be more resilient in our organizations, one of the things that we've seen with developers and those who put IT into production and operate it is DevOps. Is DevOps been a lesson to be learned or something to be avoided? Is this something that we can take to other silos when we try to breach how organizations communicate and relate to one another to make them more resilient?
I think so. Ultimately, there's lots of different ways that people will phrase DevOps, but what I think about is taking what used to be a very, very big thing and acknowledging that you can't comprehend the complexity of that big thing. And so choosing instead to embrace the idea that you should do lots of little things. In aggregate, they're going to end up being a big thing. And that, I think, is the core ethos of DevOps, right? Is that each individual developer is going to write a little bit of code and then they're going to ship it. And you're going to do that over and over and over. And you're going to do that very, very, very quickly. And they're going to be responsible for running their own thing. That's the operations part of the development. But the result is, over time, you'll get closer to a good product because you'll have the opportunity to get feedback from customers. You'll be able to see how it's working in reality. You'll be able to get testing that takes place with real data. There are lots of advantages like that. But the critical part of it from a security standpoint is it also makes it possible for you to respond to security flaws in near real time. So often, organizations just aren't pushing code frequently enough to be able to know how to fix a security problem. They're like, our next release window is 90 days from now. I can't possibly do anything between now and then. And so getting to a point where you have an improvement process that's really, really flexible and that's being exercised every single day is what you get by having DevOps. And so if you think about that same mentality for other parts of your organization, it definitely makes them able to react when something unexpected happens.
So perhaps we should be looking to our software development organizations for some lessons and messaging and cultural methods that we can employ elsewhere. They're on the bleeding edge of being more secure, more productive, and they're doing it through better communications and better culture.
It's interesting phrasing it that way because that sounds highfalutin and like they've achieved it out of some, expertise and brilliance. What it really is I think the humbleness of realizing that the compiler tells you your code is wrong every single day and there's a new user bug every single day. And eventually you get beaten down by all of those and you decide, we're just going to react every single day instead of having this big thing. And so, I think DevOps actually, it is a better system, but it's a result of realizing how many flaws there were in the people that were running the previous system more so than anything highfalutin, that's for sure.
The software doesn't just eat the world. Software can show the world the new, better way.
Yeah, hopefully so.
All right. We're almost out of time, Adrian. It's been great speaking with you. Any ideas for the future? Any thoughts about if we're going to have better security, privacy, resilience, and we have to address culture, and we need that messaging to be pervasive, and not just the IT organization, but across the company, what do you see happening? And I'd love to hear maybe some projections about where machine learning and artificial intelligence and that ability to analyze more and more of what goes on as a harbinger of improvements to come?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing that's going on right now in the context of security is the realization by all of the senior executives, right, and boards that security is something that they need to be proponents for. And the pushing to actually make it possible for organizations to be more secure. That has fascinating ramifications all the way down the line. I think if you look at the best security organizations, they're realizing that the way they can enable security within their companies, within their customers, is to make security as easy as possible. And so you get this combination of the non-security executives saying security is our number one thing, the security executives realizing that the way that they can actually implement security being the number one thing is to make it as easy as possible to get it embraced and to not have it be disruptive. And so we're seeing faster and faster investment in security that actually works because it's easier. And I think it's going to make a huge difference. There are a number of foundational technology shifts that are going on that are also turning out to be very pro-security, which wasn't why they were built, but is turning out to be the case, right? We saw in the consumer space that the move towards the web rather than desktop applications enabled greater security. We saw the movement towards mobile operating systems as the primary mechanism for interacting with the web versus desktop operating systems. It turns out that those had a sort of fundamentally more secure design. And so the risks there have gone down. The enterprise has been a little bit slow, but I see the shift away from behind the firewall software towards cloud-based software as one that is enabling a lot better security for most organizations. And eventually, I think it will for all organizations. So those shifts are happening at the same time you've got these cultural shifts happening. So I'm actually really optimistic that over the next decade or 2 decades, we're going to get to a point where security is not something that we have to talk about. It's something that is sort of built in and expected in much the same way that we don't spend too much time now talking about, do you have access to the internet? But that used to be a critical stumbling block for a lot of things was, I won't have access tomorrow. It's hard to find a place anymore now that you won't have that kind of access.
Right. So these things will become part and parcel of good business conduct. And we'll just think of it as doing a good job. And those companies that don't do a good job, well, they'll suffer the consequences. And perhaps the Darwinian nature of capitalism will take over.
I think it will.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening to a sponsored BriefingsDirect discussion on building a security-minded culture within public and private organizations. And we've learned how behavior, culture, attitude, and organizational shifts from both create both hurdles and solutions to making businesses more intrinsically resilient by nature. So a big thank you to our guest. We've been talking with Adrian Ludwig. He's Chief Information Security Officer at Atlassian. Thank you so much, Adrian. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dan. Had a good time as well.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this BriefingsDirect IT security culture discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout this series of traceable AI-sponsored BriefingsDirect interviews. Stay tuned for our next podcast in this series with a deep dive look at new security tools and methods with Sanjay Nagaraj, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Traceable AI. Look for other security podcasts and content at www.briefingsdirect.com. Hey, thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your business community and do come back next time.